And one of the things that is so many part of the misstatements, misinformation, propaganda is that uh, people who use cannabis over an extended period of time somehow are going to be non-productive members of society. And I can tell you that my patients include some of the best doctors in Santa Barbara, some of the best attorneys in Santa Barbara, representatives of law enforcement, uh, millionaires. I don't know if I have any billionaires. I don't go into people's expenses, but I do know that I have people who live in Montecito, which is the very upscale part of Santa Barbara. It's where the old money resides. I also have a lot of creative people, in part, I think, because attention deficit disorder is associated with creativity, but I have some scriptwriters, I have some famous directors, and I have one celebrity who I can share with you because he wrote a book. And in the book, he talks about, he said he wrote 3 paragraphs on me, but they got cut out of the book. But there is a picture of this man holding a letter, and the caption says, "Here I am looking at a letter, at the best piece of mail I ever got, a letter from Dr. Bearman telling me to smoke more pot." Now, I did not tell this patient to smoke more pot, and this patient's book was originally going to be titled "My Lifelong Love Affair with Marijuana," and was later changed to "It Ain't Easy Being Me," and this man's name is Rodney Dangerfield. Rodney first started using cannabis with the actor who played Grandpa on the Munsters, Al Lewis. And it must have shortened Al's life. He only lived to be 94. Uh, so there just are an enormous spectrum of people who use cannabis, and the only thing that they have in common that distinguishes them is they have a medical problem that responds to cannabis. There's nothing else that I can see that ties these people together. And the patient population that I have is as diverse as the patient population of anybody who would be a primary care provider.
Well, now I do want to get to the law that's or the initiatives that are being promoted in California.
Right.
And because I think we're at a critical juncture here, so if you can.
Right. There sometimes you have to be careful of what you ask for because you might get it. And I take a look at what's going on in the state of Colorado and the state of Washington, and they are two fairly dramatically different situations. In the state of Washington, it appears to me that they have effectively thrown medical marijuana under the bus.
Yeah.
And this is the usual motive, greed, and accompanied by the usual problem of stupidity. I'm very disappointed with the state of Washington, even preceding this law, because the medical school, and I graduated from the University of Washington School of Medicine, denied doing a liver transplant on a patient because he was using cannabis. Now, I had a patient who had not one but 2 liver transplants from UCLA, and the reason he got the second one is they felt that they had erred in the first one, that the liver had waited too long between the person whose liver it was originally and the person they transplanted it to. And this fella used cannabis, as many people with transplants do, to deal with the side effects of the medication that interferes with the effectiveness of the immune system. And he told the people at UCLA that, and they followed his liver function, and they said, "Looks fine to us. We don't see any adverse effects on your liver transplant from your use of cannabis to deal with the side effects of the medication we're giving you to suppress, that's the immunosuppressant." So They also, I think, got rid of all of the dispensaries that they had and started over again. Whereas in Colorado, the dispensaries that had been in existence for medical were given first crack at continuing to be dispensaries. I gave a presentation in Costa Rica with an attorney from Denver and also a city council member from Denver. And what they had to say was very interesting. The city council member had been somebody that had been somewhat dubious and now was very comfortable with the regulations that they had in place and with the history that they had in terms of the safety. These were not magnets for crime, these dispensaries. And I think that the favorable results that people had received from the medicinal use of cannabis. You're also seeing in Colorado a number of dispensaries and growers who are contributing money or cannabis to doing studies with this. Now, one of the studies that's being done there is actually being funded by MAPS, not by any growers there, and that's being done by Dr. Susan Sicily. And Dr. Sicily is very impressive as a researcher, and she's very innocent in a way. I heard her give a presentation at a conference in Denver a couple of years ago, talking about the barriers that she ran into even after getting the approval of the federal government. And she said, somewhat perplexed, and I'm a Republican. And I happened to run into her in Palm Beach at the last year's Patients Out of Time conference, and I asked her somewhat humorously if she was still a Republican. She just smiled. She didn't answer on that. But the fact of the matter is, by the way, that the Republicans are in many ways more receptive to medical cannabis than Democrats. I really don't want to sit here and be critical. And the Libertarians are even more receptive. And the introduction to my book is written by Judge Jim Gray, and Judge Gray was the Libertarian candidate for vice president in 2012. And Gray wrote a book in 1994, Why the Drug War Failed, and How to Fix It. And he is a very active member of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And they are probably the most effective speakers in terms of being critical of the prohibition. The prohibition, there is absolutely no basis for the prohibition, and the prohibition has caused an enormous number of problems. And in fact, Jimmy Carter, when he ran for president, said he was going to get rid of that prohibition. And unfortunately, the Southern Democrats, we now call them Southern Republicans, threw up as many barriers to Jimmy Carter as they're throwing up to President Obama. And if anybody should be impeached, it's some of these people in the House of Representatives who don't understand that they have a responsibility to do their job. And probably the people in the Senate are even worse because they're not holding hearings on the U.S. Supreme Court, which is supposed to be a co-equal branch of our government and is not supposed to be held hostage by the legislative branch.
So you did mention your book, and I really wanted to mention it as well, because the title is Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, and how discrimination and greed created a dysfunctional drug policy and how it can be fixed.
Right.
So are there some simple steps that we could start with that you recommend?
Yeah, the first thing that I would recommend is rescheduling cannabis to probably Schedule 5, but more realistically, it would probably go to Schedule 3. And the reason that I say it's realistic to put it at Schedule 3 is that tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, which is the principal euphoriant in cannabis, is Schedule 3. So if it's the euphoria that they're worried about, then make it Schedule 3. Now, the reason I say make it Schedule 5 is that in 1971, Roger Eggerberg, Dr. Eggerberg, who was the former dean of the School of Medicine at USC, and at that time was the Undersecretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for Education, said cannabis is in Schedule 1 temporarily, and what we're waiting for is some additional studies. And I think that he had reference to the 1972 Nixon Marijuana Commission report, which recommended legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. So even Schedule 5 is too high a schedule if we are to follow the lead of the Undersecretary of Health for HEW. And that's later been split into the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. So that would do a lot of things. Number one, it would get more physicians to recognize the medicinal value of cannabis. But I think even more importantly is that it would allow for more aggressive, more extensive, more rigorous research, which a lot of people call for, but most of the people that are calling for it immediately throw roadblocks in the way of doing such research. I think the next thing to do is to recognize that the Controlled Substances Act is unconstitutional. In the case called Gonzalez versus Raich, Angel Raich is a person who has meningiomas. These are tumors of the lining of the brain, and the skull is pretty inelastic, so it's important for them not to grow. And the cannabis interferes with their growing so that she can have fewer debulking surgeries, brain surgeries, to remove these growths. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, granted her a permanent injunction against the federal government to prevent them from arresting her. This was appealed by the George W. Bush administration, and in a very controversial 6-3 decision, that decision was reversed. The 3 dissenting justices might surprise some of the people looking at this because they were 3 of the 4 most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. They were Sandra Day O'Connor, joined by the late Chief Justice Rehnquist, and current sitting Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. None of these 3 would be confused with being a liberal Supreme Court justice. And the attorney for Ms. Raich was a guy named Bennett, I think his name is Robert Bennett, who was one of the top and is one of the top libertarian-leaning law professors. He teaches at Boston University, and it was a states' rights case. And the most outspoken member of the Supreme Court at that time on states' rights was the late, and I would say unlamented, Anton Scalia. But Scalia, through his principles, if he had any, out the window, and joined the so-called liberals on the court in invoking a 1942 case called Wickert versus Filburn, which Scalia has railed about at the highest level of his voice as distorting the balance of power between the federal government and the states. But apparently he was willing to make an exception when it came to applying that case to cannabis. The federal government has no authority to regulate the practice of medicine. This is affirmed by the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and a 1925 case called Linder versus the United States that has never been overturned and was not overturned by Gonzalez versus Raich, all of which say that cannabis, that the states are the ones that have the legal authority to regulate the practice of medicine.
The California initiatives, can
Right.
you address those? And there's 2 that I believe, the AUMA and MCLR, and I don't know what the difference is. One seems to be a little more popular amongst patients, and one more for business people.
Yeah, I'm not intimately familiar with the specific details of either of them. I am currently leaning against AUMA even though many of the people that are associated with it are friends of mine, have talked to me about it, and they feel comfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable with any initiative that's 62 pages long because I think that the courts can play with that and come up with whatever interpretation the court wants. I also am very uncomfortable with it because I believe that it incorporates three laws that were passed by the state legislature, which means that only another initiative can change those laws. And I'm uncomfortable with those laws, only because I don't trust the legislature. And again, these are three fairly lengthy pieces of legislation, and I'm not familiar with them. I hope to become more familiar with them as we go forward into the future. The other thing that bothers me about going with an initiative, and the more detailed the initiative is, the more concerned I am about it, because I don't know that we need that kind of regulation, and we got along just fine without that kind of legislation from 1854 until 1942, when cannabis was in the United States pharmacopoeia. And it seems to me that since cannabis is, according to the DEA's chief administrative law judge in his finding of fact in 1988 after a 2-year rescheduling hearing, cannabis is one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. So I don't know why we need all of this regulation. So I would say before anybody votes yes on either one of them, I would demand that they read the entire thing and feel comfortable with it. What I am concerned about is that we could end up marginalizing medicinal cannabis. And the other thing is that after almost 20 years of having Prop 215 on the books, we have clarified most of the ambiguity in that. And it's taken almost all of the 20 years to clarify that ambiguity. And so I feel that if either one of these passes, there will be some ambiguity. And because the AUMA is longer, I think there'll be more ambiguity with that than there will with the other one, merely because it's shorter. And I'm also concerned because of the support from people in the cannabis business. Is the more regulated this becomes, and the more this becomes like a big business, the more we're going to push out some of the pioneers and some of the people who are most knowledgeable about this.
Do you think it opens the door for big farm?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that, but that's not a reason to vote against it, because the door is already open to big pharma. And look, you've got the federal government has approved the phase 3 studies for both Sativex and Epidiolex. Now, GW Pharmaceuticals is not big pharma. However, their product is distributed around the world by 5 different pharmaceutical companies, and they are all big pharma. The company that has the distribution rights for England and Canada is Bayer, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. The European Union is Almirall, the second largest pharmaceutical company in Spain. Even though their products aren't legal in the United States, Otsuka, the largest pharmaceutical company in Japan, has the pharmaceutical rights for that. And the distribution rights for Africa, Asia, and Australia are held by Novartis, a Swiss company, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. So the door is open for Big Pharma, and Big Pharma is already operating in at least 15 countries in the world with tincture of cannabis, which is marijuana. you're having many other countries that are taking a close look at this. Australia is on the verge of having a national law. The state of Victoria, I know, has changed their law. Now, in terms of the details of their law, I don't know what it is, but I do think that they are looking at this in a more practical, more serious way than the California state legislature did, and I'm afraid then the federal government will. I mean, in Australia, you had the prime minister, equivalent to the president, publicly endorsing the legalization of medicinal cannabis. In this country, to I think many activists in medicinal cannabis, that President Obama has been a disappointment. Now, I think that he probably made a calculation that he would be able to get nothing else done if he put this at the beginning of his to-do list. And it may be that the fact that the DEA is looking at rescheduling cannabis sometime this summer, that may be the work of Obama, and it may be that he is doing what some people thought he might do, which is towards the end of his term, weigh in on this. To Obama's credit, he did put in his autobiography that he used cannabis. I think he couldn't help but be that candid, because I had a classmate of his from Occidental, which is where he went before Harvard, that he was one of the number one marijuana smokers at Occidental. Now, on the other hand, Occidental is a pretty conservative place, so that might not mean much. And I also have some patients from Hawaii who say that Barry, which is what he was named as then, and his cousin were some of the biggest marijuana dealers in high school. Again, I don't know how much marijuana people smoke in high school in Hawaii 30 years ago. And Obama had given signals during his presidential campaign that he would address cannabis differently than his predecessors. And he has. Unfortunately, the federal government was so far off base that even the improvements that Obama made were not dramatic enough, and hopefully he will make some dramatic changes before he leaves office.